Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Dr. Allan J. Hamilton, who is a professor of neurosurgery at the Arizona Medical Center and was formerly chairman of the Department of Surgery there. He's presently also executive director of the Arizona Simulation, Technology, and Education Center. He's the author of a new book, The Scalpel and the Soul. Dr. Hamilton, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you for having me here.
Where were you born and raised?
Just outside New York City in Kew Gardens.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
I think my mom was of European descent, and I think we sort of grew up in a household with a lot of different influences and a lot of different cultures, a lot of different languages. My mom spoke 3 languages. I went for many years to a French school, the Lycée Français, so it was very kind of a multicultural experience. We were kind of a mongrel, but a vigorous hybrid, I guess is the way to describe it.
And you early on started writing, were encouraged to write journals, basically, and obviously that prepared you for all the writing that you would do later.
My grandfather was a poet for a certain period of time, and then actually went into the oil business. But he was a very literate man, had a wonderful library, and one of the things when I spent a lot of time, he sort of raised me. And I spent almost every summer with him, and he had this routine. In the morning, he would assign me a topic to write an essay on, and then I would hand the topic in at dinner time, and in the morning it would come back corrected, and sometimes there'd be assignments of poetry that I had to memorize, and we even sang a few arias together from operas, but he was very encouraging about writing, and one of the things he insisted on was that I keep a journal, and I've done that since I'm 16.
And you have 25 volumes? Is that what I read?
Oh, it's huge. I just was going through another box of, I just put 20 more volumes away in a box and thought to myself, this is getting ridiculous. Nobody's ever going to read all of this, but yeah. I've kept it since I was 1956. And
early in your life, Theodore Roosevelt became a hero for you, and that seems to have been important for you.
Teddy Roosevelt was a very important character for me. We did not live very far away from Sagamore Hill, and it was one of my favorite trips that we could take on the weekend. And one of the things that struck me about Teddy Roosevelt was that he was kind of shy. He was nearsighted. I took my glasses off today. He was nearsighted. He had asthma, which I do. He was a big collector as a child, which I was. I had stamp collection and butterfly collections and that sort of thing. And I was a very shy kid. I sort of kept to myself. And on weekends, I would go as frequently as I could with my dad to Sagamore Hill. And we'd be walking around, and he would tell me the story of this small, diminutive, nearsighted, shy, asthmatic kid who sort of took on his own kind of heroic proportions, kind of a passion for living. And he would remind me over and over, he says, see how many things are the same between you and Teddy Roosevelt. So,
that's wonderful.
So he kind of inoculated me with that.
And so then where did you do your undergraduate studies?
I did my undergraduate work at Ithaca College. I actually went there with the intention of becoming a fine arts painter. Unfortunately, as happens with some painters, I discovered that the eye inside my head was not necessarily as good as what came out on canvas, and I made a decision to become an English teacher and try to at least be able to eke out a living doing that.
And where did you do your undergraduate work?
At Ithaca College.
And there you had who for writing? It sort of struck me when I read it in the acknowledgement.
Yeah, I had a very remarkable writing teacher. I was very fortunate that Rod Serling, who developed the Twilight Zone and was very involved in writing for a number of television and movie projects. Ended up, has a residence near Ithaca, and ended up being a creative writing teacher for several years at Ithaca College. Rod died very young. He actually died 2 years after I graduated. But in that time, I was introduced to some of the greats in science fiction like Harlan Ellison and Ray Bradbury, who came to talk to our class, obviously because of their connection to Mr. Serling. And he was a wonderful kind of teacher. He not only taught by example, but he also would take you very far afield sometimes. I remember he insisted that I take a semester, actually ended up being 2, with Dr. Harcourt, who taught Shakespeare. And one of the courses you had to direct a couple of plays of Shakespeare, which I thought was completely out of my league. But Mr. Serling insisted that I do it to get a sort of feel for how writing translates and that sort of thing. And I had 2 years of working with Rod Serling as my creative writing teacher.
It's interesting because the subtitle of your book is Encounters with Surgery, the Supernatural, and the Healing Power of Hope. And I'm just curious, did he help you in some way that you can't even discern to sort of be interested in those kind of topics?
You know, it's the first time that I've even thought about that. I have to say, I really looked at Rod purely as one of these people who got his students to understand the power of storytelling. I love that expression that the Zuni Indians have, which are, there are no truths, they're just stories. And certainly Rod was a great storyteller. He also was an incredibly active listener. I've never quite met anybody who listened as actively as he did. So I never thought about that until you just mentioned it, but of course with his interest in science fiction and of course being one of the key spokespeople, if you will, for the power of the supernatural and the public imagination, maybe I owe him more of a debt than I even acknowledged.
You can put that in the second edition.
In the second edition, yes.
What got you interested in medicine then?
It was kind of in a roundabout way. I had an unusual fluke at the end of my junior and senior year at Ithaca College, where one of my jobs was working in a laboratory, and one of the research professors that I worked for had this experiment where you had to remove kidneys from rats, and you would just do this all the time. And I remember that I was very intrigued with the fine motor aspect of it and just getting lost in that. And that sort of went by the roadside. And then, of course, I was trying to find a job after college, and I couldn't get one as a teacher. The economy was very depressed. So I finally landed a job as an assistant janitor cleaning the First Presbyterian Church of Utica, New York. And so I was working as a janitor, and that led to me getting a job working for a veterinary surgeon cleaning his waiting room and cages. And bit by bit, he found me standing in the doorway looking at his surgeries. And then he said, well, if you come a little earlier, you could spend some free time standing here. And bit by bit, I got a little closer, and he said, well, you can hold this or hold that. And I realized that I absolutely loved surgery, and I loved the fine motor eye-hand coordination of it. And I decided that nothing could be more demanding than brain surgery, and it would get me to this interesting thing of where the mind and the brain met.
And you went to Harvard, and then you did residency at Massachusetts General.
That's correct.
So you're very well positioned to tell us what does it take to be a surgeon?
I have this talk that I give to medical students who come in. I'm an advisor for the students who go into surgery. And I always say, well, why do you want to go into surgery? And what I'm looking for, the answer where, if they say to me, I just absolutely can't think of anything else that I want to do, I just turn the paper around and I say, sign here. Because those people I know are going to make it. there's something magical about surgery. There's something that, about the operating room and the fact that it really is a theater and a place of drama, and you don your special costumes and you go in with a lot of ritual. And the other thing is this flow state that happens when surgery is going the way it should. And the clock stands still and you don't feel your back or your bladder. You look up and 5 hours have flown by, and another 4 hours later, everybody in the operating room shift has changed, and you've just oblivious to it. You're just lost in the work of in your hands and your eyes, and being in that flow state.
And being a brain surgeon is a very particular subcategory of surgery, because you're on a battlefield where the slightest movement could get you at the wrong place at the wrong time. Talk a little about that, because it's a very delicate environment. What's so special about brain surgery?
Well, there are two things that I always try to remember about brain surgery that makes it very different from everything else. One, you're operating on an organ that defines the human being. I mean, we are what our brain makes us, what our mind makes us. So you're operating on a very special organ, nothing that you can really compare to anything else. You can't compare it to a computer, you can't compare it to a heart, a muscle. The second thing, and I think it has a magical quality all of its own, obviously. And then the second thing that you're aware of is there are no mistakes. The brain is one of the few tissues that will not repair. A muscle, I can get a muscle to repair. Bowel, I can take an extra 2 inches of bowel. You can't take an extra 2 inches, can't even take an extra 2 millimeters sometimes of brain. So you're in an environment where you really have to be thinking 5 steps ahead in your moves, and every one of them has to be measured about the ability of, am I going to commit an error in judgment or technique that I cannot take back, as it were? You know that thing on the chessboard? Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's really a rule, but the way my brother and I played is if your hand stayed on the chess piece, you could move it back. Mm-hmm. So in neurosurgery, there's always this thought of, okay, is this a move? And now can I take my hand off the piece and leave it where it is on the chessboard?
You say in the book that if you make a mistake, it can really, affect you, I guess is the best way to say it, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you really learn from your mistakes, in the sense that the next patient may be a beneficiary of what you saw because of your previous error.
I think the loneliest moments I've ever had in my whole life have been when I've been in the middle of a surgery and realized I made a mistake. And it happens in complete silence. You know, the monitors are still beeping, the nurses are still circulating, everybody's still handing instruments, but you alone inside, you're like in this sarcophagus of your own thoughts where you go, oh my God, that mistake I cannot take back. I might be able to minimize it, but I can't take it back. And then you say to yourself, you can't stand there and in that moment of panic, in that moment of loneliness, and say, I need help. You really have to move on. And so to the unseen eye, it just rolls by. Mm-hmm. But inside, it's as if somebody turned the lights out. And it's a very dark, lonely feeling when you make those mistakes. I think we also all live with a problem that I'm really working hard to solve, and that is there are a certain number of patients that each one carries around in our heart where we know earlier in our careers our technique may not have been as good, our judgment may not have been as good, and had we operated on them later, at the height of our abilities, we might have saved them where we lost them earlier. Mm-hmm. And we all carry that list, and hopefully it's very, very short, but it's a very painful list.
And in your present work, as I understand it, you're trying to see how through education and technology you can enhance the capability of the surgeon.
I think we now have the technology with, we have very sophisticated computerized mannequins. They breathe, they change their heartbeat, they have pulses, their pupils dilate, their tongues swell, their veins change. We have, with the computerized mannequins, the sophisticated virtual reality trainers, and then we have been developing a whole slew of simulated tissues. We don't use any animal tissues, but we can create skin, blood vessels, tumors, bowel, uterus, whatever we want. So we have the capability essentially of creating an environment in which we can, number one, train till we're absolutely sure we've got people at a fixed level. The idea of going down and making mistakes on human beings as a way of training is not one that anybody's comfortable with, most importantly the medical student and the resident, and obviously the patient and their family. The second thing is it's much more akin to the way we train pilots. Nobody gets on a plane and says to the pilot, you know, we don't poke our head in the cockpit and say, hey, how many of these planes have you crashed? We expect that the pilot has learned how to handle every contingency. In the facility that we have, which is really a think tank of surgeons and engineers, we literally go and look at how many of these situations can we simulate, how many of these mistakes can we create and then drill so that they don't happen anymore. And we now use very sophisticated computers to analyze their hand movements so we can tell by computer when somebody has trained adequately that their movements are very close to, for example, an expert's movements.
When you graduated from Harvard, I believe from the medical school, you heard a speech by Professor Volkmann, and he warned you as students, graduating students, to become doctors and not technicians, medical technicians. And in a way, this book that I want to talk about now, your new book, is a journey of how you came to that truth throughout your career. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. Dr. Volkmann gave a talk. He's one of the greatest men I ever knew. He just recently passed away about a month and a half ago. And Dr. Volkmann gave this talk at graduation or convocation of, is there a doctor in the house? And of course, the irony is that there were 120 doctors in the house that day. But what he meant was that he saw that healthcare had gotten so fragmented. And I'm struck today when you go around and round on patients, very often they have no idea who their doctor is. They'll tell you, sometimes they have no idea who operated on them. And you know, you'll get an answer like, I'm with the red team, or I'm with the trauma team. And you know,
the car.
Yeah, you know, it's really amazing sometimes. Yeah. And so what he was talking about was this idea that a patient needs one doctor who can be their advocate, who can be the person who coordinates all of these tests, who can really put everything into perspective. And has had an extended conversation with the patient, almost a friendship, if you will, a partnership, and that is really what a doctor is. And I learned that the hard way. I thought, you know, I came out, I wanted to operate as fast as I could. If my patients were doing well, they didn't need my help. They were headed home. I had residents to take care of them. I'd only worry about the ones that had problems. And then I found myself in Operation Desert Storm. I damaged my back very badly. And I was lying, was non-ambulatory, lying in a bed. And I remember just sitting in that bed all day, waiting for the 30 seconds that the team would show up at the foot of the bed and talk to me. And the nurse was very nice. At the end of the day, she would wheel me over to the payphone so I could tell my wife what the doctor said. And that really drove home to me just what Dr. Volkmann was talking about, how important it was to really have contact. And I swore if I ever got back on my feet again and could walk after that, a day would never go by that I wouldn't see every single patient, and usually twice a day. And I tried after that to always round when the families were there at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the evening, so I could answer any questions they had.
So in a way, you are suggesting that you became a better doctor as you explored aspects of the people's lives who you wound up doing surgery. Your book is a collection of very interesting stories, but they're the steps that are of a journey that you took to a kind of understanding that made you better at being what Volkmann was talking about.
I think in part that's true. I think also along the way, the patients taught me a number of lessons about how much who we are, what we are willing to bring to the table, what we're willing to marshal as our emotional and spiritual resources, how much of an impact that can have on our recovery, on the process of returning back to life. I've seen over and over with the patients that an illness can serve almost as a uniquely powerful opportunity for transformation. It's when we're stressed, it's when mortality weighs, when we start to look at what's our legacy, what are our values. And what surprised me was I was totally unprepared for the fact that my patient's spiritual challenges were going to reflect back on me and begin to make me ask a lot of questions about what I was about, what I believed in, what my values were. And along the way, I think my patients changed me profoundly, and they gave me a lot of advice and wisdom about how I could help and how other patients could help themselves through illness.
Now, as a writer telling these stories, but a writer who happens to be a scientist and a surgeon, you have to navigate a terrain in which the information that you're getting is not information that would be readily acceptable by traditional medicine. How have you dealt with that over time and in your writing?
My whole life has been dedicated to such a large extent to hardcore science. I mean, I made my reputation in computer guidance systems in surgery, gene vectors for brain tumors, new polymer delivery systems. So I had good scientific credentials, and I have to say the last thing in the world I thought I would be writing is a book about spirituality and its impact on medicine. So I sort of came at it in some ways as a non-believer, as it were. Mm-hmm. So that extent, I've at least got some credentials and credibility. I think the second thing is I did not want to go farther out than I really believed that the facts of each case, of each story would allow me to. But I thought you could draw inferences, and I could certainly report what it felt like to me and what it evoked within me, and that was certainly a reasonable position. As well as talking about where the science dwelled and in a lot of these cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about some of the cases that you refer to, and one picks up, I guess, the themes from your youth, because as a young doctor, you went to Africa, basically, to do clinical work there, guided sort of by the model of Albert Schweitzer. Talk a little about that, and then you learned something. I think in that experience, you're saying that that what traditional cultures could bring that maybe sometimes traditional medicine can't.
Africa was a watershed, a whole collection of watershed events. I wasn't even necessarily wanted to go to Africa again. In part, I went to Africa because I thought that's what Teddy Roosevelt would have done, and the adventure of going to Africa. And I did end up at Schweitzer's hospital in Lambaréné in Gabon. And one of my assignments was to carry out childhood immunizations in some of the farther flung villages. And there were no roads to these villages. The way that we got is during the wet season, when the rivers would rise, that would create waterways that we could take a boat. Calling it a boat's really, it's not a boat, it's a dugout with an outboard motor on it. And we would take these dugouts out to these fishing communities and do the immunizations. In this particular story, we had filled the dugout with all of our supplies. We had it up on the shore ready to go in the morning. Unfortunately, during the night, the river rose and carried the boat away. It took us most of the day to find it. We dragged it back to the hospital, re-outfitted it. That night, I took the precaution of tying it to a truck.
Yeah.
I felt the truck was unlikely to wash away.
Yeah.
So the result of that was that we were a day late in our departure. And we rode down this torrent of a river. Unfortunately, with the river flowing, a lot of the landmarks that the guides used were washed away. And we were very concerned. We came to a fork in the river, and we couldn't tell if it was the right or the left fork. And one fork was going to take us to the villages we were supposed to go, and the other was going to carry us at breakneck speed in the wrong direction. And at the last minute, we made the decision to crash land right in the fork of the river and kind of claw our way up the bank and drag the boat behind us. And we're lying there completely soaked, and this very, very majestic, dignified African native gentleman was standing there looking at us slightly bemused, and like the drowned rats we were. And I looked up at him and I said, "Oh, thank goodness you're here. We're lost." And he says, "I know." And I said, "Well, we're looking for this one particular village." And he says, "Oh, I know. I had a dream that you were going to be lost, and my dream told me to come to this fork in the river and wait for you." And then he said, "You know, but the strange thing is the dream told me to be here yesterday." Now, we were miles and miles away. There were no cell phones, no radios. There was no way this gentleman couldn't have known that we were delayed by a whole day. Certainly was funny that his dream had told him exactly where to be, and furthermore that he had the faith in his dream to wait for 24 hours for us. And then, here I am coming from Harvard Medical School, and suddenly the success and failure of my medical mission is dependent on the dream of a perfect stranger and his faith in his own dreams. And because of him, we were able to successfully immunize hundreds of children. But it certainly gives you pause to think that this is a very different way of interacting with the universe than I was used to back in Boston, Massachusetts.
You're suggesting in a way that in a traditional culture, individuals may be attuned, and their brains may be attuned to signals. I've got to be careful here. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that signals that that point them in the right direction, basically. Is that what we're to read here? I mean, is it that they're embedded in traditional cultures that give them the signals that make something like this happen? Or
in Africa and certainly in other cultures, I've seen a different quality, but very much the same thing in Native American cultures. The world is alive. It's suffused with influences and powers that are constantly at work around you. We do not tend to see the world like that. We tend to see the world as very mute and concrete and scientific and rational. Well, if you're living in a world where all of this is at work constantly, and these interpretations of daily life are given in that context, you begin to have a little bit of a shift. And the example that I like to use is that you and I are going for a hike up here in the beautiful mountains in California, and we're walking along. And we take in the scenery and drink it in. It just so happens behind us on the trail is a great photographer like Ansel Adams. Now, he sees the same landscape, the same signals hitting the retina, And now he takes a camera and he extracts the meaning and the magic and the power and the majesty. It was all there, but we didn't have the lens in the eye to see it. It's all the same. I think the same thing happens with what we call coincidence or premonitions or omens or what have you. They're just signals that we normally tune out in our world that in other cultures they're listened to with a great sense of immediacy.
There are a number of beautifully told case studies here, and I want to recommend to our audience that they go out and buy the book. And I tried to jot down some notes that generally describe all the people you're describing. And so these different kinds of patients, everything from young children who've been burned, to a senior African woman who basically is determined to intervene in behalf of her grandchild, even though she is told that she has a cancer. And I wrote down these adjectives. That these people, you characterize them, they're insightful. Some are lucky. Some are unlucky. They're on the edge of what we perceive to be the abyss. And they are looking for companionship, whether from their own family or from the rituals and so on, from living people and from dead people. But often they're reconciled to their fate, and you say at one point they ride their fate about one of the particular. Talk a little about that, because it's really quite fascinating, but you're drawing out common themes from all of these.
I believe that in some ways, being superstitious, for example, or believing in luck can seem kind of silly. On the other hand, if you look at it in a deeper way, well, let me first give you an example. I may be operating on a brain tumor and people are looking in and they see the operation going so smoothly and everything's flowing and they go, oh, what a master technician he must be. And you go, no. How lucky that the planes are dividing the way they are. Superstition in some ways is nothing more than a kind of admitting that there are a lot of influences that you can't necessarily control. I think that was one of the things that I found the most humbling and that I saw as one of the most ennobling traits in so many of these patients was a sense of accepting certain limitations and at the same time not willing to concede to others, not letting other people set boundaries for them, not letting other people's expectations, if you will, stand in the way of what they thought was possible.
And this was because, in a way, what you were talking about before, they're in this crisis situation. They're on the edge. They're at that place where, death is just across the road, so to speak.
I think they're at some kind of special vortex moment, some threshold moment in their lives. And I'm fascinated, a lot of my patients, because I deal with brain tumors or cancer patients. And very often we'll get to the point where we can have conversations where I feel I can just ask them some questions and gain some insights from them. And sometimes I'll say, well, what if you could just turn the clock back? The way so many of our scientific studies, look, if we could only find the disease before it was a disease. So what if you could turn the clock back and go to a time in the past where you didn't have the disease? And almost to the last one, they say, I'd love to go back to that time, but I never would want to be the person I was then. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, because my values have been transformed, my purpose in life has been transformed, the things that I deem important, the things that I decided that I want as part of my legacy are different. Mm-hmm. So there really is this sense for so many of us that severe illness and major surgery may be one of the most important gateways we're going to gain into spiritual transformation. And we don't want to miss it. We're all going to go through it. We want to marshal our resources. We all have this inclination, if there's ever a moment that we want to reach out to powers greater than ourselves, that's one of them. So it's very, very special for the patient and very special for the physician.
Well, one of the cases that you described that really affects one as you read it was a young burn victim. We don't need to go into the details of the case, but in other words, he needed replacement skin, and because of what had happened to him, his father died suddenly, and he wasn't aware of that, and so his father's skin was used. And this young person experienced something. Tell our audience what that was. It almost supernatural in a way.
It really felt that way for me. This person had been in a coma, as you say. We were in a last-ditch effort. He was dying. We were able to use the skin grafts from his father very suddenly, a matter of hours after the surgery. A nurse came to the door and said, he's waking up, he's trying to talk. And I said, that's impossible. I went to the bedside, and sure enough, he was trying to pull the tube out in his windpipe to talk. I pulled the tube out, and the very first words out of his mouth were, "What's happened to my father?" And there was no way. His father had died in a city hundreds of miles away. And I had no idea. These are the first time we'd even looked at each other and shared any words together. So I said, I lied. I was an intern. I didn't know what to say. I said, nothing. And he said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, why? And he says, well, my father, why is he standing there right there at the end of my bed? And that just hit me like a hammer blow. And I whipped around to look at the end of the bed. I didn't see anything there. And then it kind of all rushed in on me, and I said, I've got something terrible to tell you, and that is that your father's died. And he said, well, then that must be his spirit that's over there looking at me and smiling at me. And as happens in a residency, I rotated off that burn service, and I spent another 8 years in residency. I never heard of him again. On the very last day when I'm going to leave and turn my pager in finally, after a decade at the Massachusetts General Hospital, I climb on the elevator, and there's a woman that I recognize, and standing next to her is a teenager, obviously a burn patient, a former burn patient, and I recognize her. She was the boy's mother. She was the one who gave us permission to use the skin grafts from the father. And then I realized that the teenager standing there was Thomas, the little boy that I took care of. And I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that this was coming back on my very last day, as if to remind me of the importance of what I had participated in, what I had seen.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, because as you navigate this terrain of the experiences of your patient, which broaden your perspective, at the same time, you're a brain surgeon, a man whose science is the study of the brain, and but you are gathering these insights not by discovery within the brain, so to speak. So, and there's a case that I'd like to bring up in this context, and that is the doctor, the very highly respected physician, Sonnenberg, who had done a lot of the pioneer work on Alzheimer's, who had an aneurysm in the brain. You operated, and then there is this, he loses his speech because, tell us a little about, but he had to deliver a very important address, and you had an insight, and he was able, in an indirect way, to do that.
Well, I have to say, just for the record, that we obviously have changed the names and in some cases combined a character or two. In this particular case, this was difficult. This was a colleague, very esteemed in his own field. In fact, my very first impulse was to send him away to, I suggested a number of places where there were very good brain surgeons. In particular, one was at San Francisco specifically. He sort of just said, no, I want you to do the surgery. This was a tumor that was in his speech area. He had had a couple of little speech arrests. That was all that he had really had. And in doing this surgery, there was one blood vessel in particular that fed the tumor, but it went through the tumor and on into his speech area. And during the surgery, I had one of those terrible dark moments that I talked to you about where the vessel was bleeding and I realized I had to stop it and coagulate it and stop it from bleeding. But at the same time, I was pretty sure that we had cut off the circulation to this particular part of the speech area. So I had to wait for him to recover. And I went to the recovery room and sure enough, here was this incredibly famous man, and I had silenced him by the surgery, and it was a terrible thing, obviously. And then I'd seen him a couple follow-up visits, and in fact, they were dedicating a particular building with a very big deal, and they were going to have a big celebration for this, and we were talking about it. And it just occurred to me that as I was talking to him, we were talking about a couple of mutual colleagues, and it brought up a very peculiar aspect of speech that I had forgotten, and that is the brain does not understand singing as language. It understands it in a different way than language. And so all of a sudden I said, could you sing, could we sing Happy Birthday? And we sang Happy Birthday, and sure enough, he could sing. It was the first sound his wife had heard him make since surgery. And we started singing some more songs, and we sang Row, Row, Row Your Boat. And actually, he was able to put strands together that he would sing. And in fact, at the dedication, was able to thank the group by literally singing his thanks. And I thought of that line from Wayne Dyer that says, do not let yourself die with your song unsung. And I thought it was so fitting that he was literally singing his song.
So there is, as a surgeon, there's just a lot of mystery in the brain that sometimes the mystery that singing should be located in a different place than speech is, I think it would make one susceptible to the kind of stories that you're telling, actually, that is your clinical experience. Yeah.
I believe you're right. You're dealing with a magic organ. You're dealing with an organ that in some ways is given to almost a transcendental quality to it. And maybe it's being immersed for so long in that organ. There's something unusual. I don't think I talked about this in the book, but the brain has no pain receptors. The brain basically is in charge of monitoring and looking out at the entire world. Once you get past the scalp, the skull, and the dura, you can under certain situations operate on people awake, and you start to think about that. It's almost as if at a certain point you've broken into the temple itself, and once you're inside the temple, there are no guards. There's no sense of anything more that needs to be protected, and there is a sense of great of a sacred quality to where you're working when you're working on the brain. And it may be that was what sort of laid the groundwork, or maybe my choice for that particular area of subspecialty was related to trying to find a deeper meaning to things.
You're really saying in the book, or let me assert this, you can disagree with it, that these people's lives that you're describing, their culture, their relationships with their family, lead them to be at a particular place at the time of their illness that gives them insight, which we can't completely understand, but mainly gives them hope, gives them something. So they're finding the brain's capacity in a way through a different exploration. Is that fair? Or?
Yes, I think that's very fair. We have no problem accepting, for example, that people die from voodoo, that A perfectly healthy individual who believes in a particular religion has a curse put on them, and 3 or 4 days later, inexplicably is dead. We have no difficulty believing that we can die of fright, that we can die from stress. So those are all situations in which our emotions bring about our death. But for some reason, the converse creates a lot of controversy, that our thoughts and our will can bring us to life. Every physician has had countless examples of patients with illness or terminal illness who said, I want to stay alive till my granddaughter's wedding, or I want to make it to Christmas or this particular event. And you ask yourself, well, how does that happen? You know, if it's all preordained and it's a disease and it's unaffected by this, how does somebody keep themselves alive to a particular date? And physicians will go, well, that's just their, will, and you go, okay, well, how does that happen? That is perfectly acceptable. I had a colleague recently at this book, when this book came out, he said, I can't believe you wrote this book. You, of all people, you're respected, you're a chairman of surgery. Why are you talking about spirituality and the divine and the supernatural? And I said, well, I thought it was important. I wasn't really prepared for it in my education. I thought my patients had taught me a lot. And I think these influences, we all see them. And he said to me, just in turning, he said, yeah, I always know when something's going wrong with one of my children long before I get the phone call. I have a sixth sense about this. And then walked away. And I kind of just shrugged. He said, but I think this happens every day in every single hospital. And it's a very common event. We just are not comfortable as physicians and as scientists necessarily talking about it. Our patients are far more comfortable. They're embracing it. They use it every day.
You have a story toward the end of the book. This was not a surgery you were involved in. We'll not go through all the details because we don't have time. But the fact, and in fact, people should buy the book just for this story, but a woman has a brain operation. Essentially, her brain is disconnected for a 20-minute period. But then when she awakens after the operation, she is able to recall conversations and descriptions of the room which she had no way of knowing, and this has all been, scientifically demonstrated. And you draw some powerful conclusions from that, at least powerful conclusions in the sense that they point you further in the direction that you're going in this book.
And I'm talking in that particular chapter as a scientist. I know that this woman had, during this 20 minutes, no blood flow, no oxygen delivery, no electrical activity in her brain at all. Dead by every criteria that we have. EEGs are readable by anybody, that kind of thing. The brain should not be able to make a memory under those circumstances. So to have this woman wake up afterwards and report specific memories in that interval raises a very interesting conundrum for me as a scientist, which is, if her brain's incapable of making those memories, number one, where were those memories made in that interval? Where did they reside? And then how, from there, did they get back into the brain once it was capable of making memories? So we're closer and closer, if you will, to this concept of, could there be a consciousness that is independent of the brain, independent of the mind that resides in the brain? And, here I am as a neurosurgeon, and I'm stuck with this. What do I make of it? And, I've got all of this evidence that's pointing me towards a consciousness that's viable, completely separate from the brain itself. That's one step, I guess, closer to the Holy Grail of saying, yes, consciousness exists separate from life.
Mm-hmm. I thought when I realized that you had studied under Rod Serling that if he were still with us, you could submit this as a story for the Twilight Zone. But in fact, it's not fiction.
No, it's not fiction, and the problem with it is that you end up sort of bogged down in a lot of the scientific minutia, as opposed to I think the greater theme of what is this life separate? Somebody raised the question in the last couple of days with me of of patients with Alzheimer's who slowly begin to lose their focus and their presence. And the question arose, where does the presence go? You know, is it literally destroyed in the brain, or does it raise the possibility that perhaps the presence after a while finds the brain no longer hospitable enough, sumptuous enough to support the presence, and it vacates? I don't know. You know, maybe you know, Mr. Serling would. I'm sure he'd at least ask me to submit it and get back to me with some red marks on it next week on Tuesday.
At the end of your book, and again, I recommend it highly to our audience. It's just a great read, and I also recommend they read it more than once, actually, because the first time you don't absorb all that's there. But at the end, you have some advice for patients who might be going into surgery. And, you know, everything from don't underestimate luck, don't trade quality for quantity, listen to your favorite music. And I'm trying to summarize these, and I made this note: don't let medicine take you prisoner. Is what I thought you were saying, which is not to say don't not do what your doctors are telling you, but see beyond it.
The idea that medicine strips your identity like a prisoner, I think, is very important. It takes our rings, our earrings, our wallets, everything, and says, you know, I'm going to put you in this nameless, faceless situation. The patients who do well are the ones they are homo indomitus. They are wild men and wild women, and they come in their favorite T-shirt and their favorite sweatpants, and instead of those, you know, little paper slippers, they've got the big bunny slippers with the floppy ears, or the Homer Simpsons. They've got their favorite bathrobe on. They're not wearing those gowns that are open in the back. I think that's one thing. They maintain their integrity of I am a disease in an individual and a whole human being, not an isolated disease. That's one. And I think the other part of don't let medicine take you prisoner is don't let medicine constrain your outcome. So often we are faced with physicians talking about this issue of, well, I didn't want them to have false hope. And I go, well, what is hope? You know, Andy Weil makes this point in integrative medicine. Hope is the desire to prevail against overwhelming odds. What do you mean you don't want them to have a false hope? I think so often we give statistics. I was talking the other day to somebody who told me they had they brought their 18-month-old child in who had a particular tumor, and the doctor said this in a devastating way, the most you could hope for is that maybe your child would survive, you know, severely mentally retarded. And he told me that child's now grown up, graduated college, has a master's degree, has a family, holds down a job. But can you imagine the parents of that child having to summon up so much courage and determination and so much power to say, I'm not going to allow that to be the boundaries that define the outcome. So in so many ways, the patients who make it, who take over, become the captains of their recovery, are the ones who have said, number one, I'm not going to be your prisoner, but number two, I'm taking no prisoners.
We've picked up in the course of this interview a number of the themes from your early life, Teddy Roosevelt, Rod Serling, but in the end now I mean in this next stage of your life you are teaching a course for medical students using horses. So this harkens back to your days in the veterinary. Talk a little about that, because horses have something to teach doctors about patients.
Horses are magical creatures in their own way. They're incredibly sensitive to emotional energy. The idea of teaching medical students about nonverbal body language and nonverbal communication, that's the language that horses use. They don't use words, they don't use a language other than their body language. It occurred to me one day, we were very late in clinic. We were a crowd of residents and me and some other doctors. We burst into a patient's room. The patient literally went, ah! Screamed because we came in so suddenly. And at that moment, it occurred to me, if you ever walked into a horse's stall like that, you'd end up flying in the other direction. And it just began to occur to me that there are a lot of things about a 1,200-pound patient that make you very, very aware of what your body's saying. And I have to say that we studied with the students some videotapes, which I'm ashamed to say we started with mine. And one of the first videotapes, I was looking at CT scans and MRI scans, and I was putting them on the light table like this, and the patient was behind me, and I was putting them up and going, well, this is what we see here, this is what we see here, this is what we see here. And one of the medical students said, well, what would happen if we brought their chair next to mine and we were having the conversation physically of the two of us facing, confronting the information together that was in the CT scan, the MRI. Those are the kinds of things a horse looks for automatically. In a way, integrity is your body saying what your mouth says. You know, when the doctor walks in and says, please tell me what brought you to the hospital, and then looks like this at their watch and says, no, just tell me what's wrong right now. You know, very clearly, they're not interested in your story. Their body's telling you. And so integrity in a way is when your body and your words are saying what you really mean.
Finally, requiring a brief answer, a lot of students at Berkeley are interested in going to medical school. What do you think is most important that they can do to prepare for medicine? Obviously taking all the science courses, but what else? Is there something that would put them on the road that you've gone on in this book?
I'm going to say something a little radical. I don't think the science is that important in terms of building good physicians, great physicians. I think I look for candidates who have very broad backgrounds. I would bring as much of your character and your integrity as you can. I worry about the disillusionment. And I look at the medical students coming in now. They're a new generation, and they are the best and the brightest hope that we have. And I think they're definitely coming with a different attitude than we did 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And what is that attitude?
I think it's much more willing to be open to the possibilities. I mean, there were no courses in spirituality and medicine when I went to medical school. Now there are over 70 schools that offer curriculum that the medical students can take. I see the medical students asking to have some of these experiences with the patient, yearning for them, looking for them. And it wasn't something that ever occurred to me when I was going through medical school.
Dr. Hamilton, I want to thank you very much for discussing your book. I want to show the book again, The Scalpel and the Soul, and I'm sure our audience will want to go out and buy it. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.